thank you so much again, Marilyn, for coming.
You're welcome.
And I'll let her go ahead.
Well, a few of you know me. My name is Marilyn Herman. I am a retired family living educator for the University of Wisconsin Extension. So they call me a professor emeritus. No money. Don't worry about it. But what's interesting is, in the 1980, okay, anybody around in 1980? Yeah. Okay, well, I at that time I was working as a home economist in Green Bay. And the American Cancer Society put out this cookbook called Ethnic Cooking, and it's full of Wisconsin favorite recipes, and it identified the name of the recipe, which is wonderful, but then also what nationality it came from. And that just fascinated me. And in that front of it was this map, which indicated where the first immigrants settled by community. And it's graphically organized. So if you can find Waupaca County, and this is when you get your glasses on, really. Primarily up in the Waupaca area were the Danish. Danish was a strong Danish community. Iola Helvetia was a lot of the Norwegians. Down towards New London was the Irish, Lebanon, Irish, right? And down the middle were the Germans. Middle of Waupaca County, down the middle. From like Clintonville, Manawa, down, pretty much the middle. And if you can read the hashtags, you can see. But you can go to any county and see what the first immigrants. Now, the Wisconsin Historical Society has this in a very glorified map, color-coded, suitable for framing. Isn't that what they say? Yeah. Which shows all of this in a very wonderful way. And you can buy it, or you can get it online, or just look at it online if you want to get more detail. But what's interesting is this is where the first settlers came, and then you know how it is that people intermarry and they move and they, but this is the first immigrants. So basically, that's what got me started. So I've been at this since the 1980s. I'm a historian by love and a home economist by income. So I try to blend the two as best I can whenever I can. So that's which got us to this topic. The Wisconsin Historical Society also has this book called Putting Down Roots. And it's a summary of some of the research and efforts that have gone on at Old World Wisconsin. And so they have a settlement community, and they have a traditional Norwegian house and a German house, and it has a garden and the typical animals. So as you walk around, you can see all those you can see it. And many of my pictures are actually from Old World, Wisconsin. And since this author couldn't be here, you get me. Another Wisconsin book, this Flavor of Wisconsin, was written and compiled by a good friend of mine. And in it, she's got the stories and some of the recipes of what makes Wisconsin unique. And this is a wonderful book as well. There are other ones in the back that look at specifically just the gardens of Wisconsin, and that book is back there if you want to look at it. And there's another one from the Wisconsin Historical Society. So if you want to look at the books that are available through the Wisconsin Historical Society, they'd be glad to take your online order and send you whatever you want. So that's my plug for them. So putting down roots, I'm going to, let's see, if I stand right here, is that going to interfere? Huh? Well, I don't need the podium, I just need to be out of the way. I don't know. Do you want to move the, I guess you're going to have to do that anyway, and I'll stand back here. How's that? We don't want heads in the picture. That's just, no, that's fine. Okay, so here's the, let's see if that works. Okay, so putting down roots and the importance of eating fresh in Wisconsin. There was not a lot of grocery stores. You either grew it or you didn't survive. It's interesting that they invented the tin can 10 years before they invented the can opener. So they would just take a knife and they'd have to hack away at the top to get out. Like, okay, this isn't good. Okay, now if you can notice, this is traditional garb. In immigrant, we're talking the 1840s through the 1890s, that era. No problem with skin cancer, right? It was not fashionable for women to be tan. That was a sign of lower class. So you did everything you could to keep your skin as white as possible, which meant a wide-brimmed hat, long sleeves, gloves, a long skirt. Today, can you imagine wearing that today? And you took a bath once a week, whether you needed it or not. Okay, go ahead. So here's a typical Wisconsin immigrant first settlement. This is the 1880s, and this is pretty impressive. Now, some of the pictures I have from the Wisconsin Historical Society, of course, they're black and white because they're original pictures. But pretty proud of the fact that they've not only gotten a barn built, all the outbuildings for the pigs and chickens and whatever, but they took the picture because they finally got the house done. The house was always the last building to get built. Typically, they would live in either half the barn or one of the outbuildings until they got the house done, which was warm in the winter. Go ahead. So this is what you'll see if you do go to Old World, Wisconsin, which is a marvelous tour. Take the kids. They've got lots of activities for kids. They're growing the traditional heirloom varieties of the plants that would have grown at that era, traditional animals of the era, and gardening methods, which is fascinating. Go ahead. So before 1820, I want to go back to the Native American population who were here. The Oneida were moved here from New York. The Iroquois, they're Iroquois, were moved here in the 1820s, 30s, 40s. They're moved out west. This is when Wisconsin was still part of Michigan. So in their traditional way of gardening, they called it Three Sisters. You always planted things, companion planting. You know, that's such a modern term, you know, right? But they would plant the pumpkins or squash with the beans and the corn. And the corn ended up being the trellis for the beans. And then the corn would shelter from the sun so the pumpkins could grow. And it was a good example of companion planting. Go ahead. They also, does that look like a Native American teepee? They also figured out pretty slick. Not only haystacks would dry faster if you put them in a pyramid, but also plants would grow up. And it was pretty fun to send the kids out, and the kids would pick on the inside and mom would pick on the outside. And they'd get their beans or peas or whatever it was. Go ahead. So there also was a ritual in the Native American culture that they had certain songs that they would use as they planted their gardens to create the right atmosphere. So it was just important to prepare your own spirit to start your garden as it was to plant the garden. You were an integral part of the garden. You had to be in the right frame of mind. Okay. This is a Native American fenced-in garden. Now, barbed wire was not invented until after the Civil War. So we're talking 1820s, 30s. So what do? You put a stake in the ground and you weave the twigs when they're fresh, and as they dry, believe me, no wild animal is getting into that shelter. So there's their garden. Now you have to think about all the wild animals that also want a part of your garden. So keeping animals out was a pretty key, not only your own animals, but the wild animals. Go ahead. No, you would have had like a step ladder, a three-step step ladder, and a step down. No, there was no gate. No, you did steps. Steps up, steps down. So just about every job required everybody's help. Kids were not in playing video games while mom was gardening. Everybody had a job in order to survive. Go ahead. Here's a picture from, I think it was 1870, 69 or 70. But already you can see whose job. Now, the little guy he's got his cup there. He's ready for his first cup of milk. You know, hey, sis, can I have a cup of milk? And it was girls' job, no matter how young, to milk. The boys would escort the cattle to the water, to the pond, to the river. They would make sure they had something to eat. They would keep an eye on them so that the wild animals wouldn't get them. That was the older boys' job. So even at that young age, they all had a job. Go ahead. Here's a pretty typical homestead in Wisconsin. And you know, that road needs work. You better talk to your town about that road. But actually, the rivers were the first roads. And after the rivers, then they would use the Indian trails. So like the river through New London from Fremont to New London, that would freeze. And that's when they would bring the settlers up. Early winter. And they'd have to build something quick for the rest of the winter. Because you couldn't get through in the summer. You couldn't get your oxen. You couldn't get the big wagons. You had to use the ice. So it wasn't easy. And believe me, those roads were rutted. They were muddy. It was not a pretty picture. Go ahead. So the farm women were responsible for tending the livestock in the winter. They did not only did they have to keep the house going, but they had to do all the chores. Because their men took off to earn real money, either as carpenters or loggers or farm hands somewhere else. And that was pretty typical 1880s, 1890s that the men left for the winter. And hopefully, especially if they were logging, they went up, they logged, and then they came back down the river, walking the logs along the river to get the logs down to like Waupaca or wherever, and hopefully they didn't drown. So hopefully they showed up in the spring in time to plant.
Have you seen that mural in Stevens Point about the log jam? I mean, that was the first general store because the logs would jam up there.
Yeah.
And so it was Stevens put the general store there, so it was Stevens Point.
Would not surprise me. Not easy. So here's a picture. See their dog? And you can tell they're Norwegian from the knitted hat on the girl's head. It's tight with, so you'd make a tube, and then you'd sew up the back seam, and then you'd gather the top, so you'd have these two little points. So you know that's a Norwegian family with very healthy pigs. Pretty proud of those pigs. Go ahead. So the men are up logging. Here's the white pine in northern Wisconsin. And once they had literally cut down all the white pine, then that northern area was called the cutover, because it was all cut over. And then that's when a lot of the Finnish people came, because they weren't not into clearing land. So it was already cut, so ready to go. Okay, go ahead. And the seeds, many of the families would bring seeds sewed it into the hems of their skirts on the ships. They would sew the seeds in. They would make bracelets and necklaces of the seeds, apple seeds, pear seeds, whatever, so they could then use them when they got here. You couldn't put them in your luggage because there were so many mice and rats that eat all your seeds. So they literally were on their body. And then once they settled, a lot of times, and it took anywhere from 6 months to longer to get a letter back and forth from Europe to here, but a lot of times they would make glue with starch and water and glue a few seeds in the letter. Not to make it too heavy to mail, but put a few seeds. And they send it with, here's some seeds from my garden. You'll have a little bit of me. You'll never see me again, but you'll have my flowers. And so they would go back and forth. Interesting enough, do any of you have goldenrod in your area? The Swedish settlers were amazed at goldenrod that didn't grow in Sweden. And what are the colors of Sweden, the national colors? Blue and yellow. So they sent all this goldenrod seed back to Sweden, And in Sweden, it's like the prize plant. Every garden has a little plot of goldenrod. And it's like, they're all, you know, they keep it, that's wonderful. And we're like, more weeds. But they found some seeds. 13 million year old lotus seed was found buried in a dead dry lake bed in China, and it grew. So seeds have the power to keep. Go ahead. So just to start out, here's a Danish farm garden. Now that Danish are no nonsense, believe me. They would put their house in the very front, no lawn, just the house, and then all the back was the garden. And then every other Danish farm, homestead would be around, the houses would be on the outside, the gardens would be in the center to keep, you know, animals away, and you could talk over the fence. So the community sense was in the garden. They didn't go visiting the houses, they visited at the gardens. That's a very productive garden, I would say, wouldn't you? Okay, so go ahead. So in a Danish garden, you would have lots of root vegetables. And you planted root vegetables in the dark of the moon. And you planted row crops in the light of the moon. So new moon, you planted above ground. After the full moon, you planted under all of the tuber things. So look at this. Here's a Danish. Beets, carrots, parsnip, potatoes, radishes, turnips, root parsley. You would eat the root, not you'd throw away the top. We eat the top of the parsley. They would eat the root. Rutabagas, turnips. Cold crops, they had green cabbage, red cabbage, and kale. They used strictly onions. No greens. There was no lettuce in a Danish garden. Navy beans and peas would be dried and kept for the winter. Row crops, they would grow celery and cucumbers, lots of cucumbers. And then herbs, usually mostly caraway, chives, dill, and parsley. Go ahead. Here's a Finnish garden. Notice that's a really serious fence that they got going. See the very steep roofs on their houses? They're used to lots of snow in Finland. So they weren't going to take any chances. They had heard about snow in Wisconsin, so it was steep. There's no question about it. But again, lots of rows. Marsh hay would be in between, all done by hand. Go ahead. In a Finnish garden, you would have primarily beets, carrots, potatoes, and rutabagas. And they would mostly be kept by dipping the root vegetables in wax. They would wax them and then put them in the root cellar. Oh, yes. Oh, yeah. Grocery stores went back to that because it works.
Now they stopped doing it.
Well, because they weren't washing them underneath and people would take the wax off and not wash them. Duh. You can't win. They did grow cabbage and onions. No greens again. Bush beans and peas. The only row crop that almost all the families that were Finnish grew was cucumbers. That's it. And herbs were caraway, dill, parsley, and thyme. Okay, next slide. A German garden was always in the front of the house. You had to show it off, plus you could fence it and keep an eye on it. So the original immigrant German families that came, and I am German, and my family came in the 1880s, late 1880s, but it was always 2 or 3 foot squares. Now you think about it, you got a hoe, and you could work around a square pretty easy, right? Very efficient. You knew exactly where you were because you could, and today I'm going to go crisscross. Tomorrow I'm going to go straight. I mean, you could have some fun. And if the kids were naughty, you say, all right, you got energy? You got 2 squares to do. And they'd have to go pick weeds or they'd have to go and hoe 2 squares. The Germans were the original ones that believed in companion planting. If you had cucumbers, or if you had, let's see, you have carrots, and there's lots of things that love to eat carrots. you would plant it with radishes because they would go for the radishes and you'd sacrifice the radishes and you'd get your carrots. So they had figured out, okay, you know, cabbages, all those cabbage flies, cabbage worms, if you plant some herbs around it, dill and a lot of leafy things, they'll leave the cabbage alone. Problem solved. So they did, and you'll see that. Can you see that? It's a mixed. It's not clean. Everything is mixed because they did believe in companion planting. Okay, go ahead. So in the 1880s, they had the first development of garden tillers. It was a mini plow. It was just, I've got a picture later. But you know, you can't push a mini plow through little squares. So they said you got to go to rows. So you can just go down the row. So then the later German and other gardens went to rows. Go ahead. Here are some really colorful beets, and 93% of all the heirloom seed stock is no longer grown. So if you are a gardener and you want to get into the Seed Savers program, about every so often they rotate and they want people to grow the beets, the carrots, the whatever, the flowers, the herbs, whatever, the old seed. You grow it. You have to give half of the seed that you get from that production back to them because that refreshes the seed stock so it's not all old. So every so often they have to. So if you're into Seed Savers, then they, and you say, okay, I will do this, and there's requirements. But can you imagine? Now they call those all, you know, you look at beets. Beets are all red, right? There's no wonderful variety of beets. Go ahead. This is an Irish garden. 90% flowers. Oh, and you know that's a pretty small little house, right? But if you had gardens to walk, you were in heaven. You were in heaven. And they would, when they did their wash, they'd throw all their wash over the herbs and the flowers so that everything smelled wonderful, floral, and all their tablecloths, everything smelled wonderful. Okay, go ahead. Here's an Irish garden. Now remember, most of it is flowers. So they would plant potatoes, rutabagas and turnips, cabbage, leeks and onions. They had lettuce and spinach, and the only herb they really planted was parsley. Now, isn't that a little different mix than what the German or, yeah. So that's an Irish garden, kind of half-hearted, pretty limited. There was mostly, you know, meat, potato on the side. Go ahead. So here is a Polish garden. Again, the squares, but they're much further apart. And you can see the big, the pole beans are growing on the pole. I think it's pole beans, not hops. I think it's pole beans. Outhouse in the back. Very critical. Okay, go ahead. So if you were in a Polish garden, these are typical things that you would see. Beets, carrots, cellaring. Anybody still grows that? It's like a spicy licorice tasting celery, but it's licorice tasting. It's pretty good. Usually cream it. You know, cook it and cream it. Horseradish. Oh, that got moved over. Parsnips, potatoes, root parsley. Again, they'd eat the roots, throw the leaves of the parsley away. Rutabaga and turnips. Cabbage and kohlrabi. Onions. They did have lettuce. Bush beans, pole beans, runner beans. Any kind of bean was fine by them. Peas. They did grow cucumbers. And then the herbs, caraway, chives, dill, parsley, poppy, sage, marjoram, and thyme. Lots of herbs, which they used into wonderful dishes. Wonderful dishes. Go ahead. Lavender was grown. This is a typical 1850s watering can, and they would call it a watering pot. The Irish, because they had to water those flowers, you know. Had to take care of them. But the lavender is a natural mosquito repellent and tick repellent. So they were pretty smart. Go ahead. Oh, here's an English garden. They're working on that. Go ahead. And primarily a lot of herbs because they were making tea. So if it made tea, it was a good herb to grow. Again, they did some companion planting to pick that up from their German neighbors. They have vegetables, herbs, and a lot of things around the kitchen. Go ahead. This is an English garden. They had beets, carrots, parsnip, potatoes, salsify. That is salsify. It's like a black carrot. And turnips. And I put a picture because everybody goes like, what's salsify? Salsify is long, skinny. You peel it like a carrot. You cut it up. You mash it like potatoes, or you slice it, or you throw it in soup or stew. It's one of those, like, it's a good root vegetable. It lasts forever. They did have cabbage and onions, lettuce and spinach, bush beans and pole beans and peas. They're row crops. They grew peppers. A cashew squash, which is round. It's a round squash. Not a flat one, it's a round squash. They did grow summer squash, not zucchini, but summer squash that you could put your fingernail through the peel. And Hubbard squash, which was mostly for the animals. Cows and pigs love Hubbard squash. In fact, they still grow Hubbard squash and feed it as livestock feed or grind it up. If you've ever been cleaning out a pumpkin and you got cats, they just go nuts for the inside strings. I mean, it's natural vitamin A. It helps resist infection and disease. Animals love squash. And most of the squash you buy when you buy a can of pumpkin for a pie, it's Hubbard squash. Yeah. And they would grow tomatoes. This is the first group that would grow tomatoes. Parsley, sage, marjoram, and thyme were their main spices. Go ahead. I'm mostly talking vegetable gardens, but most of these groups also had orchards, which was, apples, pears, grapes, currants, a lot of currants. So here's a typical grape arbor. Go ahead. And some are getting fancier and fancier. Once you put in an arbor, that means, no, hubby, we're not leaving. This is home. We're not going west again. This is it. I put the apple trees in. I put the pear trees in. I put the arbor in. That's it. We're staying. That was a sign of stability. Go ahead. So down the bottom, that's a single harrow. That's what in the 1880s transformed the gardens to rows. So you could push that and clean the weeds out way faster. Up on top, the blacksmith would make your hoe, and then you would provide your own stick. And the last picture is a wheelbarrow. And you would weave the basket of it in the winter. Most farms would weave baskets to send their potatoes to market, to send their apples to market, to whatever they were sending to market. They would make the basket. There was no paper bags. You would have to weave the baskets. Everything was work. I'm tired. Go ahead. So we haven't progressed very much. Here's a whole fence to keep the small animals out. Go ahead. And here are three other typical fences you would have seen in early Wisconsin. The bottom one was preferred, and that was a Norwegian style fence because the big animals couldn't get through, but the kids could climb it. And so when you asked earlier, how did they get in and out of that totally enclosed, that's what they would have done. They would have built a ladder up and down on both sides of that enclosure. That's a ladder. That's also a very good fence. Also, the snow would blow right through it, so you wouldn't get big piles of snow. So it really was a very efficient fence. The rail fence, made famous by Abraham Lincoln, how many rails could he split in a day? But they didn't hold up very well, especially to Wisconsin's snow and wind. Didn't do very well. So then the bottom one is a little more substantial. You can see it's got two posts, and then they would just put dividers in between. And if you hit a stone, you just move it over a little bit. So the fences were kind of like, they weren't straight. They were just like generally, what was the easiest place to put a hole? Go ahead. They did have the cold frames. And that was usually done with sapling wood to get things started, especially up north. The Finnish, I mean, when you're up north, they have, what, a growing season of 2.5 months? I mean, they had to get things started earlier.
What did they put on?
They would put cloth, cotton cloth, like sheet-like material, because there's no such thing as plastic. I mean, it was cloth. Go ahead. Or it could have been, yeah, it was mostly cloth. Here's some hops growing. And even my family in the 1880s, they grew hops. They made their own beer. Thank you very much. But it was the Germans that invented the glass jars, or using the glass jars as an insulated, instead of that cold frame, they would use the glass jars over the small tomato plants or over. Number one, the sun would get in, the rain could still get around it, the animals couldn't eat it until it got bigger. So it worked out pretty good. Go ahead. Here's a hand-woven twig support for the peas or the beans. And that was done with twigs, not rope, twigs. But they did grow, most places did grow hemp. Most households grew hemp. So they did have weaving material. They used it mostly for baskets. Go ahead. Also in the gardens, they would plant herbs. Mice hate mint. They will not crawl through mint. So if you don't mind, and mint is a 4-letter word, so it's a weed, if they would plant it on both sides of a fence, so the rabbits and the mice wouldn't crawl in or crawl out. So if you had a rabbit or a mouse or rat inside, they couldn't get out either, because they weren't going to crawl through the mint. But mint was very effective and then you just harvested it for your tea. And to this day, if you go to old homesteads that have fallen apart and there's just like the foundation left, you'll still see mint growing around that foundation, because those foundations weren't very tight. So, and if it was really bad, you just sprinkle the dried mint on your floors to keep the mice from running all over your house. You know, it was, yeah, go ahead. So the herbs also drew the insects away from their vegetables and their lettuce and their beans. So they sacrificed the herbs. The insects went for them instead. I think that looks like lettuce. It looks like it. But any of the herbs are either nursery plants or they're protective. And the insects will eat them, suck their life, and then leave the vegetable alone. Go ahead. So here's the German garden. We have beets, carrots, celery, again, parsley. That's root parsley. Horseradish, scorzonia, that's that, which is a black carrot too. It's in that same family as the other. Turnips. Red cabbage, green cabbage, Savoy cabbage, kale, kohlrabi. They like their coals. Alliums, garlic, leeks, and onions. Our greens, they had, this is the only group that grew corn. Only group. Corn salad was pretty popular. Endive, lettuce, and spinach. Bush beans, runner beans, and peas. Cucumbers. And their herb choices were caraway, dill, parsley, summer savory, marjoram, and thyme. They're pretty fancy cooks. Go ahead. Here's a Norwegian kitchen garden. There is some corn there. They picked up from their German neighbors. Looks pretty impressive. Up in this top corner, you can see that there's quite a few arbors. That's actually a whole grape. That's all grapes up in this corner. These are all grapes. Go ahead. In a Norwegian garden, you'd have beets, carrots, potatoes, rutabaga, turnips, cabbage, and onions. No greens, no legumes. Cucumbers, watermelon, the only group with watermelon. Herbs, caraway, dill, mint, parsley, marjoram, and thyme. Go ahead. So here's some Norwegian immigrants. Now you might think, oh, that's, they're a proud family. You know why they took the picture? Look at their stash of wood for the winter. They were really proud of the fact that they were ready for the winter. Go ahead. It was very common to gather your friends and family for a wedding, which would probably be a week's worth of partying and cooking and everything else. I just had a wedding. I can appreciate this. Okay, go ahead. In the early Wisconsin communities banded together to get a local school to hire a teacher, which usually stayed in the homes during the school year. And they also sponsored the community events. And most children learn English at school. That's one of the main reasons that settlers sent their kids to school. Learn English, then you can translate for us, you can help teach us. Things haven't changed very much. Go ahead. Here's some sweethearts. It was very uncommon to have a horse. It was more common to have oxen. They were much more useful. They can pull a plow better, pull your wagon, your stuff to your homestead. Most families had oxen, not horses. Go ahead. And this is an early threshing machine. You see, some of us remember tractors and long pulleys, but this was the early ones. This is pretty modern. You'd carry that from farm to farm. Put your old workhorse on it. Thrash away. Go ahead. A good team of horses was worth a lot, but it also costs a lot. So you were very likely to rent the horses, not your own, rent them with the wagon, get to your place, and then send it back. Send the horses and the wagon back. It was just a way of getting there. Once the trains got in, though, in the 1880s, then they would use the train. But before that, they would rent horses. And if you got them back alive, then you got your deposit back. Go ahead. And those horses had to do a lot of work because they had to break that sod, which hadn't been broken before. Go ahead. Here they're taking a picnic lunch out to the men in the hayfield. Pretty proud. Go ahead. Some real serious horsepower here. Notice it's a one plow. It's going to take a long time to get that field done. Go ahead. And the same thing with the planting. That's a planter. He's walking. Go ahead. And here they're hauling logs. Go ahead. And the pigs. Pigs provided not only meat and bacon and everything else, but also manure for your garden and everything else. Happy pigs, happy life. You also had chickens and ducks and hens and everything else, primarily to eat the insects, then to lay the eggs, and then to have the stew pot. So chickens and ducks were pretty much a staple. And they were inside that fence, that garden fence. They had work to do. Go ahead. Cows were milked by hand, and the milk was poured into a cream separator, and then every day you'd haul that. Usually the kids would haul the milk to the creamery. Their cream or the milk, depending on what they had. Go ahead. And the sheep, not only for the meat, if you were English or Irish, that was your preferred meat, mutton or lamb. You could weave the wool. And you ever hear the expression, don't let anybody get your goat? Well, if you put a goat in with your cows, the goat would actually fight the coyote or the fox or the wolf and protect. Go ahead. Now, this is a happy pig going in for the night. They would lock all their animals in, try to keep them from the animals. Go ahead. And cooking for the family, a lot of work. Everything was by hand. Go ahead. They would either make soap or cook big pots outside because you don't need that heat out in the need it in the house. So a lot of cooking went on outside. Go ahead. Here they're making sauerkraut. They're slicing it and then pounding it with salt to go in the crocks. And if you happen to have a red ring crock, you're pretty rich. Go ahead. Here they're making a big stew. You can see the meat grinder She's got some pretty fancy tools there. Go ahead. So if you looked in the magazines of the era before they went out to the outhouse, the preferred 1870s, 1880 tools, meat grinders were real popular. Sifters, that was a big improvement. Go ahead. Oh, what did it do? Did it get stuck? What does it say? Oh, it should go. There we go. Ice shavers. And, you know, they'd cut ice in the winter and store it in the sawdust. And so ice shavers were pretty popular. Can openers, see? Can openers, that's what they look like. There's a percolator. Mason jars. A mason jar, it describes the threading on the top. That's what made it mason, was the fact that it had a threading. You could thread it. And isn't that a nice egg beater? Go ahead. Beats doing it by hand. So recipes were passed down from the family. Usually you would just watch until you got it down pat. Most of Wisconsin families had a root cellar, dirt floor, dirt walls, pretty damp, kept things, especially all those root vegetables, very well. Go ahead. Most vegetables were mashed. They might have been mixed with eggs and made more like a souffle or scallop. Was pretty common. Go ahead. Oh, that wood cook stove made the best bread. There's some Irish soda bread. Go ahead. And here's some original canning, which really didn't get popular until actually the 1890s, 1900, before they really got into canning. Before that, it was mostly waxing and root celery and pickling. So this was a newfangled idea. Yes?
You're a home economist.
Yes, yes.
Don't those jars look really not tack right?
Oh, of course. Well, of course, but that was, you know, this is, yeah.
But I mean, they seem like there's too much air at the top.
Well, we know that now, but in those days, they didn't know that. But it was pretty typical in the spring. The housewife would take a wheelbarrow down to the root cellar, and about half of the stuff they had canned would go into the wheelbarrow because it was rotting, it was oozing, it was, you know. And they'd pour it out, and they'd carry it over to the animals, and they'd feed it, and the animals would get sick, and then, you know, or they'd just dump it in the field. But about half the stuff didn't keep. They didn't tell you that part. But it was, you know, when they were doing spring cleaning, they were actually, the root cellar was pretty slimy by the springtime. Yep, go ahead. You know, and even if they screwed up the canning, root cellars were, you know, they ran between 10, 15 degrees and 50 degrees. It's really like a refrigerator. So even though they didn't know much about canning, at least it was kind of like refrigerated. So here's a typical holiday, and each one of us has some background of what our celebrations were. And I think that's the last one. Yep. And I did, oh, now where did I put it? Is there a red bag over there? Back? Okay, I need that red bag. So I've been talking, probably way too long. Here we go. This is what I need. Okay, so I have some slips of paper here, and I'm going to just pass them out. And I'd like you to read what nationality it is and what it is today that we have because of them as immigrants. So I'll give you one. Can I give you one? Can I give you one? I'm going to give you one. That's what happens when you sit in the front. Uh-huh. Maybe that one. Oh, sorry about that. Okay, who wants to start? Stand up and just read what's on your sheet. Somebody, go ahead.
Polish settler gardens. Diligence, persistence, and thrift. Scented geraniums, watering cans, chickens and ducks, barley soup, pork roast with caraway, Savoy cabbage, fresh cabbage and sauerkraut, cucumber salad, cream style with dill weed, pierogi with cabbage filling, poppy seed cake with poppy seed custard frosting.
Now, do you eat those things today? Some of those, you know what they are. That's from the Norwegian heritage. Who wants, somebody else jump up. Who wants to go next? Okay, we got a volunteer here.
Okay. What was woman's work in the settler's world, 1810 to 1890? Women handled domestic life. They gave birth, raised large families, cared for the sick, cooked, baked, churned butter, made cheese, wine, and cider, brewed ale, preserved food. They made candles and soap, did laundry and cleaned house. They sheared sheep to card, dye, spin, and weave wool, milked cows, fed pigs, mended clothes. They tended the garden and planned local school and church events. Men built the barn and outbuildings, fences, and then a home. They hunted or trapped and worked the fields in the spring, summer, and fall. Men and older teens spent winters at logging camps as carpenters in the city or other trades, bought and sold land, took public office, built local schools and churches.
Okay. Who's next? I'm tired.
I'll read about the English settler gardens. It says Yankee Bright Future. So we have window boxes, decorated flower beds and flower arrangements in the house. Our lawns are fancier. New England brown bread, bean soup, turnip stewed in butter, potato pudding, salsify, spinach, pickled radishes, baked apples with custard sauce, popcorn, and squash pie.
Ah, so it's those English that gave us lawns. I'm going to... Oh, dear. Thank you. Who wants to jump in next?
Irish settler garden from
Okay.
shanty to lace curtains. Howling out of pumpkin, turnip, or rutabaga. Rose gardens, sweet and pot herbs, borage, rosemary. Thyme, summer savory, lavender, hyssop. Marjoram, sweet basil, Irish soda bread. Boiled dinner, creamed cod over boiled potatoes. Currant yeast bread, fresh fruits bottled. Burning a match in a jar to remove air. Sponge cake, potato fudge, cough syrup.
Yes, they invented cough syrup.
What's potato fudge?
Have you ever had cheese fudge? Okay. You basically use the potato, you have the mashed potatoes, and you add the chocolate and the butter, and you make fudge, and instead of marshmallow as your base of the fudge, it's potato. Potato, sugar. That's really good. The recipe is in the book if you want to copy it down. But don't follow the... Huh?
Potatoes are probably better for you than marshmallows.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. But it's really good. I've made it, and people can't. Oh, it's different, but it's really good. You know, they don't pick up potato. Who's next? Want to jump in?
German settler gardens, order, practical, eye-catching. Companion planting, wheel hoe, hotbeds and cold frames, herb soup, rye bread, turnip and potatoes, whipped, red cabbage, salsify, potatoes, apples, and sausage or bacon, onion pie, strawberry or raspberry cold soup.
Onion pie. Did you ever? Onion pie? Anybody? Oh, it's awesome. It way better than a quiche, hands down. You want to jump in?
Danish settler gardens, value of community and cooperation. Daylilies, wild plums, violets, hollyhocks, morning glories, sweet peas, petunias, marigolds, zinnias, wheelbarrow, pickled beets, pea porridge, Danish pumpernickel, pork and cabbage, Danish sugar brown potatoes, boiled red cabbage, kale and cream sauce, green kale soup, apple cake, and red berry pudding.
Now, have you eaten any of those wonderful meals? Those dishes? They come from those immigrants. Huh? You're Danish. Yeah, that's pretty standard. Anybody else hasn't read their... Oh, back in the...
A Finnish settler garden, entrepreneurial spirit, root cellar, Finnish barley pudding, rye meal bread, vegetable soup, majaka, which is leftover meat and vegetable stew, rutabaga casserole, cardamom, spice, sweet yeast bread, and Finnish rice pudding. I know a lady that instead of eating mashed potatoes now, she serves the family mashed cauliflower.
Mhm.
And at first they didn't know what it was. I mean, that wasn't even potato.
Yeah,
They
yeah,
ate it.
yeah. They don't know. Marge, do you mind?
Sure. I've got Norwegian settler gardens. Herbs for medicinal use were coffee, mint tea, flat bread, lefse, head cheese. And then on the other side of the paper it says fish soup, Norwegian potato stew, potato flour, Norwegian cabbage with sour cream, beet salad, and rhubarb custard pie.
Oh, I'll have a piece. We can thank them for all those contributions that we still enjoy today. Anybody else has got a slip that we haven't heard from? Have we heard from everybody? Well, I hope you had fun with this. Trust me, all the recipes, I mean, all those books back there have the recipes in them as well. And plus, I've got a few more up here. But the Flavor of Wisconsin is a really awesome book. And unfortunately, this particular ethnic cooking Wisconsin style is not in print anymore. So don't take it. But the Putting Down Roots and the Flavor of Wisconsin both have the recipes that go along with the gardens. And if you go down to Old World, Wisconsin, every day they feature some of those recipes at the restaurant. So,
It's an eagle.
Eagle, thank you. It's Eagle. It's almost Illinois. It's near Burlington. Yeah.
My grandchildren have gone to camp there, and when they were little, it would just be a day thing, but then it would just go into a whole week. And my grandson, he interned with the blacksmith.
Ah.
And they wore all the costumes, and they got into all the ethnic things. So I mean, they would spend weeks out there working at one of them. I was impressed with it because
Many-
I really liked it.
Yeah, many of the day trips that bus tours. If you see one for Old World, Wisconsin, get on it. Take it. You spend a couple hours there and have a really good lunch. Or if you have someone doesn't mind driving, go down for the day. Go on to something else, and make it a weekend. Old World, Wisconsin, and they've come back because the tornado went through there about 10 years ago and wiped most of it out. They had to rebuild just about everything. So they have really done a yeoman's job to get it back to where it was and even improve it. So I'm really glad that they used the opportunity for Old World, Wisconsin then to write the book so that if you can't get there, at least you can see the pictures. And I'm not as good as the original writer, but I had a lot of fun taking pictures. Yes.
With the Indians and using their three sisters, and seems like so many people coming from the east would have been exposed to that. Why did so few of them, except for the beans, carry on and not really have much of the corn or the squash? When you're given the list of the different things in the gardens, why did they drop those two?
Well, the the Germans and the Norwegians did pick up on corn from their Indian neighbors. They picked up on it. Now you have to realize that if here's the German community and here's the Norwegian community, and they each got their own church because they all have to, you got to speak Norwegian here and German here and English there, and so it took them a while to mingle. But once they did, and they all of a sudden, I'm selling my extra carrots at the grocery store, and they're really good, and then somebody else buys them because their carrots didn't turn out. You're like, oh, well, can I get some seed from you? And pretty soon they're swapping seed, and they're visiting, and they're having herb tea together, and they're tasting each other's bread, and then they have church events, and they invite the neighborhood to come to the church dinner or the church Christmas program. So eventually they started mingling, and then the garden was a natural place to learn from each other. What works, what doesn't work, and just have fun with it. You talk to your neighbors, right, about their gardens?
I
Yeah.
was listening to NPR this afternoon, and they were talking about, I think it was in Appleton, where they have the library seed program for the heirloom seeds.
Yes.
It's impressive.
Yes. 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 I grow lupines for seed savers.
I've never been able to make one of those live.
Oh, I got weeds. I got lupine weeds. Yes.
I noticed that no one was growing tomatoes. When did they?
There was only one group that grew tomatoes.
I don't remember even seeing any of them.
At that time, tomatoes were still considered an aphrodisiac.
Oh, okay. So when
And there wasn't a proper family, you wouldn't serve something like that, You wouldn't serve that to your family, especially your teenage kids, It really wasn't until World War II and all the soldiers were in Italy and they realized how good tomatoes really were. And zucchini, that all came back after World War II with the soldiers. That was not, you didn't grow. My grandmother she had their upper garden and her lower garden. And I remember as a kid, there were no tomatoes until my mom started growing them. My grandma never grew tomatoes. My good German grandma never grew tomatoes. Yes?
And also they were part of the nightshade family, and a lot of people thought they were poisoned.
Right. Exactly.
They wanted nothing to do with it.
Nope,
They thought
nope.
they poisoned everything.
Yep. Yep. And rumors, they survive. So part of why I wanted to do this, and I thank Tracy for inviting me, and I'm way over my time, but the reason I wanted to do this is, you know what? Immigrants today aren't much different than the immigrants were when they came in the 1880s. They struggle. They want to get their kids a good education. They try to hang on to traditions and foods that were comfort foods for them in their own culture. Give them time, and they all mingle. And your new best friend might be somebody from another culture. And if Danes and Norwegians can get together and be kind to each other, there's hope for all of us. So with that, I will end. And if you have individual questions, you can certainly come up, look at the books, the ones up here or the ones in the back, and just have fun with it. I hope you had a good time tonight.